Hello and welcome to The Resource, the podcast propelling employer brands to recruit smarter and retain better. I'm your host, Priscilla Peters.
And I'm your other host, Scott Dismuke. And Priscilla, here we are.
Yes.
First episode.
I know, very exciting.
We talked about this a while.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like we've been saying every time we'll be in a meeting or we'll be collaborating on something, because I know we do a lot of projects together. We're always like, yeah, we got to, and podcast has been on the list for months. So here we are. Very exciting.
I know. I'm looking forward to this. I know we got a lot of interesting guests that we're going to have. I don't want to drop too many hints, but, I at least want to entice people to subscribe and come back and listen in future months.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Why do you think this is a good time for us to launch this, Scott?
Oh, gosh, I think there's a lot of reasons. I think probably first and foremost, you have to just kind of look at the economy. We're going to, talk to Bob Costello here in a little bit and learn a little bit more about that. But just from an economic standpoint, I think that, we're coming off of COVID and COVID freight and everybody that needed freight had freight. Spot market was good. Contract was good. And now things have, kind of come back to earth post-COVID. And in those times, as we both see and hear, a lot of companies are cutting budgets and they're looking at ways to kind of cut back as the economy has slowed. And two of those areas a lot of times are in recruiting and retention. And so I think, hearing from people that are not just within the industry, but hearing from people outside of the trucking industry, because I think that's one really important thing that we don't do a lot of in transportation is hear from other people, because, there's other industries in this country that have to recruit and retain their employees. And so hearing those strategies and hearing the best practices that some of those folks do, I think is going to be key. And I'm actually looking forward to having some of those folks on that are outside of the trucking industry to kind of get their perspective on both recruiting and retention.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. And I think too, what's exciting for me is I know you guys kind of live and breathe in data a lot. We do too. We're constantly looking at data and trends. Probably the number one request we get, I'm sure it is from you too, what are you seeing? What is your data showing? What do drivers have to say? What are the trends in recruiting and retention? What should I be doing that I'm not doing? And so this will give us an opportunity to share some of that data. And really, honestly, we called it The Resource, but really that's what we're hoping, right? We're hoping it's a place where everybody comes and hangs out and uses it as a resource to really be able to recruit smarter and retain better. So, and listen, let's be real. We're going to have some fun up in here too. We know that there's going to be shenanigans. I always say, I told my husband, I said, hey, we're starting a podcast. And he was like, what? What do they know to put a microphone in front of you is terrifying. There's no telling what's going to come out of your mouth. So I know we're going to have fun too. So it's going to be exciting.
Well, I hope we have a lot of fun in doing this. We'll have to get down to business at some point, and that's why we're going to have some guests on here that maybe can do a little bit of both, have a little fun, talk some serious issues, talk transportation, talk recruiting, talk retention. But let's be honest, I think, as you said, we've sat in meetings before, probably cutting up a little more than we should, probably making some folks that are signing our paychecks not real happy that we're cutting up. So I think what we figured out is we can do a podcast and we can get paid to cut up.
Oh,
and so
yes, exactly.
I think that's part of it. We can work and have fun at the same time.
Yes, we can. I don't know if you know, but Conversion is the headquarters of fun in Nashville. So, that's what we call ourselves. So there you go.
Well, let's not poll my employees and ask them if we're at headquarters of fun.
Oh,
we may not go that high on the fun meter around here. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sure you will. All right. So we have a really cool guest today. So let's kind of get down to it. What do you say?
I'm in. Let's go for it.
All right. Well, Scott, today we have an incredible guest joining us. I've had the honor of getting to know him because he's been a keynote speaker off and on for several years, right, Bob, at the Recruitment and Retention Conference. And by the way, Bob, you always get great reviews. You always get great scores at the end. Everybody, your keynote is always a hit. You always bring really good information to us. And so I always say, don't take this wrong, but I always say you're an economist that keeps me awake. So that is, again, that's definitely a compliment. So, but we are honored to have you here today. We're super excited about the information that you're going to bring to us. So please welcome Bob Costello, Chief Economist with the American Trucking Associations.
Bob, it's great to have you today, man. We really, really appreciate you joining us. Really looking forward to picking your brain. Obviously, a lot is going on and has been going on the last several years from an economic standpoint with COVID and now post-COVID and freight recessions. And so we're really looking forward to picking your brain and kind of getting your thoughts on where things are.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. You're right. It's really unique times. So I'll try my best to help you and your viewers out. All right. So no guarantees, but I'll try my best.
All right. So we always kick things off, Bob, with what we call the first 5 serious questions that seriously do not matter, because we're pretty serious around here, as you can tell, I'm sure. So we're going to kick this off. Scott, you want to give him the first of the first 5?
Yeah. Hopefully, Bob, these are questions that you've never been asked for or asked about, but we're going to give it a shot. So in your opinion, what is the best sandwich?
The best sandwich. I just got to go with plain old ham. Like I like a ham sandwich, right? So I'm going to go with that.
Okay. Are you mustard or
Excellent.
mayo guy though? Like how do you take your ham?
No, I got to have mustard on it. No mayo.
Okay. All right. So what is your favorite movie?
Oh boy. It's funny. My wife and daughter take me to the movies kicking and screaming, right? And then I love it. All right. So, but I got to go all the way back. If there's one movie I could only watch, it's the first Raiders of the Lost Ark. I love that movie.
Okay. Have you seen the latest one?
And of course, the new one's coming out. So
June 30th. It's coming out June 30th.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know when it was coming out. I knew it was coming out soon. So, yes.
Yeah, the reviews have not been great. So, I'm hoping that all the folks that are reviewing it are wrong, because I am certainly looking forward to see that. But that is a great movie. Great movie. So, Bob, what is the most used app on your cell phone?
Oh my gosh, that's a good one. Probably the weather, just to see what's going on. You know what? I live over in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm in Washington, D.C. The other most used app is going to be Waze, because traffic is so bad around here. Every day, coming into the office and going home, I use Waze just in case something happens. Those two are that's really boring. I'm already an economist. I'm already boring and sound boring enough. I just made myself sound even worse.
That's great.
No, I think I love Waze. I'm all about Waze. You should ask Scott sometime about my directional challenges. We'll just put it that way. I have, we were speaking at a conference last week, and he was like, oh, I was driving us, which I know is funny anyway, but he said, oh, just go north and da-da-da. I said, listen, I'm in trucking, but I don't do north, south, east, west. Like I do left, right. And he was like, oh, please, but I like Waze. I like Waze too.
At least you know it. I think I have a good sense of direction, and it turns out I don't. So that's the worst of all worlds, right? I think I have it, and I don't.
Yes. Okay, number 4. What is a talent you have that only those close to you know about?
Talent I have that only... Well, I would parlo un po' italiano.
Oh.
I speak a little Italian. We go there every year. And so I've picked it up over the years. So I guess maybe that. A lot of people probably don't know that.
Yes, very interesting. I love it.
Interesting.
I love it.
And you can see my button today, the Italian flag colors. See?
Yes.
So where's your favorite place to go in Italy? That's not part of the 5, but...
Umbria. It's right next to Tuscany, just north of, it's the countryside. It's awesome. But we also love Rome. My daughter's middle name is Roma, so we also love it there.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So last question here. If you weren't doing what you're doing today, your job, your career, what would you hope to be doing?
I would have been an airline pilot, I think. And I would have been like, I would have loved to have done that. I have to travel all the time. And luckily I love planes. My wife is like, every model, I think I would have, maybe even started off in the Air Force, but everybody's like, oh, you want to fly the fighter jets? I'm like, no, give me the big transports. Okay. And I'll have my cup of coffee and fly all that freight around. Right. That's what I would have liked to have done.
That's great. That is great.
That's great.
All right, Bob, you finished the first part of the interview, the first 5, the serious questions that seriously don't matter. So we'll kind of transition here and getting to the stuff that I think probably the folks tuning in are really interested in, and particularly as it relates to the economy. So first question is, obviously, freight recession, freight slowdown, we're all kind of in the midst of it. When do you anticipate the kind of current freight recession ending? And is there any light at the end of the tunnel that isn't a train?
It's a good question. And it's really interesting because we are, in fact, in a freight recession, as you said, even though the macroeconomy has, and I've been waiting for it, has not entered a recession. And I don't even know that it will. I'd been calling for it for a while. I don't know at this point. I mean, the Federal Reserve's on the most aggressive monetary policy stance in 40 years. It's got to enter a recession at some point, but boy, it's like, so I heard the economy referred to as the Timex economy, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. But in terms of the freight recession, I guess a couple of, if we think about it, retail is in a recession. People are spending a lot more on travel and so forth versus goods. We were just moving so many goods during the beginning half of the pandemic, and then once it sort of abated, people started traveling again, and they stopped buying all these goods like they were during the pandemic. And now we're traveling and so forth. So that's hurt. Plus, we had way too much inventory on hand. Retailers are working through that. We got some numbers here recently on that, and we're making progress. It's not to where we need to be, but we're making progress. Housing's in a recession. Manufacturing is contracting year over year. So it's a tough environment out there for freight. When it ends, it's not going to boom anytime soon. My hope would be that retailers work through this glut of inventory and we get just some sort of normal or some sort of seasonal freight this fall, something which we haven't had since the pandemic, right? It started because at first we were just moving so much that wasn't really seasonal. And then last year we didn't have a fall freight season. So I think if we could get, some sort of normal seasonal freight this fall, it'll start to feel a little bit better out there. We can talk about it later, but you'll probably ask me a little bit about supply. I think that's going to impact the freight market much more than sort of the demand side. This is a supply side story going forward. But my hope is, not that the total freight, we'll probably have much, there'll be softness in housing and manufacturing through most of this year. So really it's a 2024 event, and I wouldn't expect a lot of growth next year, but we should get a little bit of growth in the freight market.
Yeah. And so you mentioned housing, and for some of our listeners and viewers, and many people in the industry, honestly, especially when I think about like flatbed companies that we work with and things like that, housing starts are a big indicator of kind of how freight is trending for them. So what is the outlook on that front? It seems kind of regionalized in a way, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, with the famous, real estate's all local, right? But so, let's move back to prior to the pandemic. We were excited about housing in the US because millennials finally started buying homes. And that meant we needed to build more new homes. And we peaked in 2021 at about 1.6 million new homes started. This year we'll be down to, we'll call it 1.3, 1.35, some million, somewhere in there. Next year about the same. And if you look at it from the peak, that's about an 18% reduction in new housing starts. Now, it's far from the 70+% reduction we saw during the Great Recession, which was housing led, but it is certainly significant. And at the end of the day, I guess all real estate, including housing starts, is being impacted by the fact that we've seen 30-year mortgages go from 3% to 7%. So why would you buy a new home and move unless you absolutely had to, right? So that's part of what's going on with housing. I think next year will be about the same as this year. We'll call it 1.3 to 1.35 million. Again, much better than we got down to 500,000 down during the depths of the Great Recession. So significantly better than that, but not, over 1.6 million we saw in 2021, 2022. So not great, but not bad. Now, those fleets that have a lot of that freight, and they might say, things are a little soft. I would encourage them to start looking at freight and say, infrastructure, right? We're going to get all this infrastructure spending, and it's just starting. So I think there's going to be a fair amount of freight that's available in that space that will help at least offset some of the softness and due to housing starts.
Do you think kind of going back pre-pandemic levels, or not quite to that point yet?
To housing starts?
Housing starts, freight overall.
I think that next year, volumes will be down this year overall. We're even seeing it in contract freight. It's not just the spot market anymore. It's also contract, although contract is much, much better than spot market. Next year, I would love to get back to sort of that 2% growth, than loads that we're used to seeing. That would be my hope. So not falling off a cliff in the contract market, but certainly April, May, we're down 3-4% year over year. Now the spot market's down significantly more than that, 50-60% year over year. So not too bad. But next year, I'd love to get back to just that boring old 2 to 3% growth in freight.
Nice. Well, kind of going back to COVID, we saw a lot of carriers raising pay. We saw a lot of carriers looking to different pay models like a guarantee pay. So those incredible increases that have come out in the last couple of years, have those pay increases for drivers impacted the industry, you think?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's impacted it in many different ways. Driver pay is the number one expense for most fleets, right? And by the way, this idea that the driver market doesn't work like other markets, baloney, right? We saw, not enough, way more demand than supply of drivers. And what happened to price? That's their pay. It went up significantly. And if you look at things like the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out data on average weekly earnings, and it's not a pure driver number, but it's pretty darn close. It's called production and non-supervisory workers. And if you look at that, historically, going back to 2000, it was, that metric would go up, close to 2% a year, 1.8% a year through 2019. Since then, though, this metric has gone up almost 7% on average per year. And the interesting thing is, it's average weekly earnings, which means pay rate times amount worked. There's, some drivers that when they get a pay raise, they elect to be home more often and drive a little less. And so that is, that even impacts this number. So real pay rates are up even more than this. Now, it is slowing down. So far this year, the data's lagged a month, so we only have through April. But in January, we went up 11.8% in this metric year over year. By February, it's down to 6.8. By March, 5.5. And April, 4.2. So it is slowing down, right, as freight slows down and so forth. But But the good news is drivers are making more money, especially if they want to. Those that want to be home more often, that it has impacts on productivity levels. But they're electing to do that. But most drivers are making more money. It was one of the few occupations that a year ago that was beating inflation in terms of wage gains. So that was good for drivers, but it is slowing down as the economy or the freight economy slows down.
So you said one thing there about productivity, and I saw some notes from I think a webinar that you did a week or so ago, talking about specifically the raise in pay and driver productivity. Could you speak to that a little bit more? Because I think there was some interesting feedback that you had on that.
Yeah, so we've done some studies on this. And what we found is, and it ranges from 20 to 40%, but from most fleets. So fleets will tell you somewhere between 20 and 40% of their drivers, when they get a pay raise, will work. Let's say, we'll just make up the numbers. They get a 10% pay raise, 20 to 40% of their drivers, we'll call it a third. A third of drivers will work 10% less, make the same amount of money, and be home more often, right? And as a guy that travels a bunch, but one night, maybe 2 nights a week, I totally get it, right? I mean, I've never seen a period too where quality of life is so important to drivers, and I don't blame them. But so what happens is then you need more trucks to haul the same amount of freight, because a third of drivers are electing to drive less when they get a pay raise, right? And again, I'm not putting blame on anybody. I get it. Like, I really do get it. But that also tells us, I know, and you guys do some great surveys for drivers and what's important to them, and pay is always up there at the top, right? I mean, I think it really is for any of us, right? I mean, it really is. I'm not surprised by that. But I will tell you what, I think the younger generation, and some more and more drivers than we used to see, pay is still important, but there's other things that are equally important or rising in importance, and it's around quality of life and so forth. I mean, I know I've got a few millennials working for me, and there's things that make them, yes, money's important, they want to make money, but there's other things too. And I think you're seeing more and more drivers where that is the case.
Yeah, we see that a lot. And I know a lot of the data that Scott, you guys have at PDA, it is the quality of life. Those specific issues and concerns for drivers have really risen to the top as of late, for sure. Okay, so when freight slows down and recruiting and retention gets a little softer, like these directors of recruiting or VPs of recruiting, their seat's not quite as hot, right? So right. They're thinking, okay, this is my sigh of relief when it comes to the driver shortage. How should we be looking at that, Bob? I know freight is slowing down, so maybe they don't need as many drivers, but those of us who are old timers who've been here a while, we know when it comes back, it's normally sometimes with a vengeance, and everyone needs drivers like yesterday. So what is kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. So as an economist, I will tell you, when I look at these things, whether it's the driver shortage or other metrics, right? Other metrics for the macroeconomy, you have your structural, causes of what's happening in the data, and then you have cyclical. Right. And what you're really talking about there, Priscilla, is the cyclical, right? We're seeing a temporary drop in freight. So that means we don't maybe demand as many drivers, but the long-term structural problems of the driver shortage have not gone away. It has simply been under the surface, because the cyclical is more important or coming to the top more right now. But listen, there are many, many reasons for the driver shortage. Demographics, high average age, lack of females, congestion, right? And you're sitting in congestion, you need more drivers than to haul same amount of freight if they were more productive. Lack of parking, we're getting some good stuff there. Hopefully that'll help. But lack of parking, the inability of what 120, 130,000 drivers since January of 2020 to pass a drug test. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for the driver shortage, and that means there's no one solution, right? It's interesting. Europe, because of their driver, the driver shortage is not unique to the U.S., by the way. It's all over the world. And in fact, Europe, in the face of their driver shortage, just lowered their starting age from 21 to 18. So, we have the pilot program, but they went across the board, automatic, everybody, go down to 18. So that's kind of interesting. So you're exactly right. So if those folks that are sitting back on, it's a little easier right now. It's soon when freight starts to come back, it's going to get really difficult again. And in fact, we've seen some drivers just leave the industry. So that means that, to your point, you said it earlier, sometimes it comes back and it comes back even worse and pretty darn quick. So that absolutely could happen. Maybe even this fall. Again, the first signal I'm looking for is to try to get just a normal seasonal fall freight season, right? And if we got that, I think even that would tighten up the driver market a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about this international markets thing for just a second, because I saw that. I've seen the data that you've shared before on driver shortage numbers for these other countries, which is very interesting. But when I saw that they changed the age in Europe, that was very eye-opening. How likely do you think that we could see that in the near future here? I know it's a big debate in the industry for sure.
It is. Well, I think we've taken the first step, and that is the pilot program. That wasn't exactly what, people were hoping for and so forth that are promoting this, but I think it's a good step in the right direction. So if you think about it, we should get data from that, but we should also start to get data from Europe. And what's happening there with 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. So, I think we'll eventually get there, simply because out of necessity, we're going to have to. I mean, part of the issue is, and this, because of that 21, and the same thing was happening in Europe, somebody graduates high school, they don't go to college, they don't go to the military, they're not sitting around waiting to become an interstate truck driver. So they go off to retail, they go off to something else. And then when they want to start making better wages with benefits, right? And this industry offers good benefits. Then they come to us, and the average age, if you go to a truck driver training school, was over 30, close to 35 years old. So that's why we have high retirements. That's why we have a high average age. So I think, Europe and the pilot program should give us some good data in the next couple of years around what are 18, 19, and 20-year-olds doing in terms of safety.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. So Bob, kind of last question here. Over the past couple of years, we have seen and we've heard from drivers that a lot of carriers are adjusting their operations model. So we've kind of touched on a few of those things during this. We've talked about an aging workforce. We've talked about a younger generation of drivers that are either entering the market or hoping to enter the market. And that younger generation, like you said, they have different priorities. And a lot of times that priority is home time. So we've seen a lot of drivers that have come into the market that want to be home daily, which is not a big shock. There's daily home time is always a big deal, or at least through the house once, twice a week, maybe even for weekends. So we've seen a lot of carriers shift their operations model to accommodate that. Do you think that we're seeing maybe an end to the days of that traditional over-the-road truck driver?
Well, you're absolutely right. We've got data that shows, dedicated freight has just surged exactly for what you're talking about, right? So that the drivers are on a regular schedule. They know when they're going to get home, once a week for a couple of days. And we've seen more regionalization of freight over the last, 15, 20 years. That helps as well. And that's sort of, we'll continue a little bit. I think we've gained a lot of that, but there's still going to be that still some over the road stuff, right? You can't get rid of all of it. I just think it's too difficult. But where possible, and we've seen it over the last, several years, and it continues, fleets are going to do as much as they can to get that dedicated freight so that those drivers do get regular at home. And I hear from other fleets, too, that say, Bob, if we can get them home every night, they actually, and this just shows that it's not all about pay, they'll take those jobs even if they pay less because they want that, right? And so I think, so my point is, Scott, that they'll do it as much as they can. It's just that I don't think you can completely get rid of that OTR driver environment. It'll shrink in size, but it won't go completely away.
Gotcha. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how all this plays out, especially as the economy comes back, and how do we recruit and retain in the new economy, if you will, the new normal. So, well, Bob, this has been great. Thank you so much. You've provided so much good information for us and our listeners. We just encourage everybody to follow Bob. I know you're a Twitter guy because I follow you on Twitter. So,
as do I.
So thank you for joining us, and go have a ham sandwich, go have some fun.
Yeah, it is about lunchtime. So
thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
All right, everybody. Because the show is called The Resource, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing on every episode is providing you with resources, with information, and things that have really kind of recently caught our eye, particularly from a data standpoint, but ultimately to help you recruit smarter and retain better. So, Priscilla, I'm going to let you kick it off. What do you have for us today?
Yeah, so just a few weeks ago, we released our spring 2023 driver survey. So if you haven't gotten that, you can go to theresource.conversionia.com and check it out. Any of our websites will have it. But it was our recent driver survey, and we asked them a lot of things. But I'm going to tell you one of the things that stood out to me was actually we asked them, how often are you recruited by other carriers? And over 50% of the drivers said once a week. Now, Scott, you know me well. You know this is a soapbox that I like to get on. But here's the deal. Listen, at any given time, this is what I always tell carriers, because I think this is where carriers drop the ball sometimes, and they don't really focus as much on this. But at any given time, your drivers are being recruited. So it should be by you. So, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on recruiting potential drivers, as you should. Like, that should be one of your primary strategies from a recruiting and retention standpoint. But let me tell you something. If you don't have a strategy in place to actually recruit your current drivers, then I feel like that's a big gap in your strategy. So, and what I mean by that is it's almost like I always say to my husband, I always use the analogy of like husband and wife. And like, even though we're married, like, we've been married 15 years. We're still dating. You know what I'm saying? Because if he's not still, quote unquote, courting me, things might get a little dicey around the old house, right? So, I always say, like, you gotta be always recruiting your current drivers. It's so important. And this latest survey tells us that yet again. Guess what? Other carriers and other employer brands are recruiting your drivers. So if you're not, you can be guaranteed someone else is. So I just thought that was really interesting. What do you got?
Well, a couple of things on that. So to your point, I'm going to drop a little bit of a hint here. I'm not going to give away too much, but I give a little bit of a hint maybe for future episodes. But one of our next guests in the next couple of episodes, I think, is going to speak a lot to that, who happens to be in kind of more of the sports arena. So that's just a little bit of a hint, but particularly that whole, not just from a recruiting standpoint, but from a retention standpoint, and how you continue to recruit your employees. So that's just just a little tidbit, just a little bit of a teaser there. So here's my data point. I'm actually pulling from the same source from our spring survey that we just released. So one of the first questions that we've asked, we've been doing these surveys for three or four, like, the last, couple of years?
Yeah.
And so the first question we've been asking is, are you currently looking for a truck driving job? And so we started asking that question, I believe, in the spring of 21. And this last survey, 33.8% of the drivers told us that they were not looking for a truck driving job. That was the lowest since we started, kind of monitoring that number. Back in the fall, so when we released our fall survey, which I think we conducted in late September, early October, released in November, that number was, so that number that said they were looking for a job was at 40%. So that number has come down to 33%, which is interesting. It surprised me a little bit because we've seen turnover up for the last couple of quarters. I think what we've learned is that turnover occurs in all economies, right? So you go back to COVID, and when freight was great, everybody was raising pay. So turnover was up because drivers were in search of that higher pay rate, right? So now, and we started seeing this at the end of Q3 of 22, is the freight started to slow down. Now that turnover is occurring, it's really occurring more from drivers looking for miles, right? And I think a lot of drivers, not really fully understanding that this is a industry-wide issue. It's not a company-specific issue. So I think that kind of speaks to kind of where we are. So I was a little surprised that number of those looking for a job was the lowest. But if you dig into that a little bit more, and some of the questions that we ask as to if you're not looking, why are you not looking? So a couple things to point out. Number one, 6.5% of the respondents said that they had retired from trucking. So I don't think that's an insignificant number. I think 6.5% is a pretty decent number when you look at if you lost 6.5% of your current workforce to retirement. That's a large number. The other two numbers that we saw in that is 17.2% of the drivers said that they needed more experience. And then almost 10% of the drivers said they were afraid to make a move in this economy. So if you take those drivers looking for more experience and those drivers afraid to make a move in economy, that's about 27%. Those are drivers that we know that the economy is going to turn. Bob was just talking about it a little bit ago. We know that the economy is going to turn, and it's going to turn relatively quick. When it does, freight will be back to maybe somewhat more of a normal, kind of freight market. And then you've got those drivers that are just needing more experience. So that 26 to 27% that told us they're not looking for a job very well could be looking for a job in the next 6 to 12 months. And so from a retention standpoint, going back to your earlier point about always be recruiting your drivers, not as well as the drivers you're wanting to bring in, I think that 27% speaks to that, because that is going to be where the tightening of that market comes, the driver market comes in that Bob was talking about. When it happens, it's going to happen quick. And that's where that 27% is going to come from, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the thing is what's interesting about that too is a lot of times people say, well, since I don't really need tons and tons of drivers right now, what should I actually be doing? This is a time where you put some things in place that help you establish what we call brand preference for when the drivers are looking. So yes, there's not a ton looking maybe today, but when that switch is flipped and they do begin to look, they're going to remember brands they've encountered. They're going to already have a brand preference kind of established. So, I think that's really interesting. And it is, when you look at those reasons, like you said, there are kind of some little segments of that indicate, it could get interesting when it does come back. So that's just some great kind of data that we had to share today as far as the resource goes. So, hey, thanks for listening. This is our first episode. Thanks so much for listening to the resource. If you had fun and you got some great information, give us a high five by leaving a rating and and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode of our shenanigans, because we know there's going to be some.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we definitely want your feedback as well. So if you've got questions or feedback that you'd like to share, hit us up on social media. You can reach out to us via email. But we'll be back on our next episode with more fun, definitely some data and some information to help you in your recruiting and retention game. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you very soon.
Bye, guys.